moves the world, making our work easier, our relationships more meaningful, our lives brighter and more beautiful. Energy has become a natural part of our daily lives that we forget. Not everyone has power to move their lives. 13 million Filipinos presently live in darkness. The Philippines still has one of the lowest electrification rates in Southeast Asia, yet the highest in electricity cost. All of these can change. Imagine a Philippines where every family has affordable and clean energy, where nature is kept for future generations to enjoy, where economic progress is possible for everyone. You can help make this a reality. The Ateneo School of Government presents its newest elective track under the Master in Public Management, Energy Transitions. Advance energy markets by influencing policies and grasping regulations. Safeguard communities through disaster preparations and accelerated restorations. Create energy solutions that make a brighter tomorrow possible for those who need it the most. Be part of the Ateneo School of Government and share in its mission to build the nation, where professionals become distinctive leaders who are ethical, excellent, and innovative.
Enroll in the Master in Public Management and become a graduate of the pioneering Energy Transitions track.
Discover meaningful leadership in energy policy for a better and brighter Philippines.
Lead with mind, serve with heart. Ateneo School of Government, forming leaders, leading reforms. Energy moves the world, making our work easier, our relationships more meaningful, our lives brighter and more beautiful. Energy has become a natural part of our daily lives that we forget. Not everyone has power to move their lives. 13 million Filipinos presently live in darkness. The Philippines still has one of the lowest electrification rates in Southeast Asia, yet the highest in electricity cost. All of these can change. Imagine a Philippines where every family has affordable and clean energy, where nature is kept for future generations to enjoy, where economic progress is possible for everyone. You can help make this a reality. The Ateneo School of Government presents its newest elective track under the Master in Public Management, Energy Transitions. Advance energy markets by influencing policies and grasping regulations. Safeguard communities through disaster preparations and accelerated restorations. Create energy solutions that make a brighter tomorrow possible for those who need it the most. Be part of the Ateneo School of Government and share in its mission to build the nation, where professionals become distinctive leaders who are ethical, excellent, and innovative.
Enroll in the Master in Public Management and become a graduate of the pioneering Energy Transitions track.
Discover meaningful leadership in energy policy for a better and brighter Philippines.
Lead with mind, serve with heart. Ateneo School of Government, forming leaders, leading reforms.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second installment of the Energy Policy Series for 2021, presented to you by the Ateneo School of Government through the Access to Sustainable Energy Program, Clean Energy Living Laboratories, or ACEP Cells project. ACEP Cells is funded by the European Union and implemented by the Ateneo School of Government. The Energy Policy Series serves as a public platform for discourse on pressing energy issues among key stakeholders in the energy sector. It features the research and policy collaboration produced by ACEP Cells' roster of research fellows in the areas of energy access, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And for today's Energy Policy Series, we are delighted to discuss the working paper entitled Rational Choices and Welfare Changes in Philippine Family Energy Demand, Evidence from Family Income and Expenditure Surveys. The working paper is already available online at ASEP's website. You may access it through the link in the chat box below. There, I just sent the link. And allow me to introduce our distinguished panel for today's Energy Policy Series. We begin with the authors of the paper. First, we have Dr. Jesus C. Dumagan. Dr. Dumagan is an affiliate professor and scientist in residence at the School of Economics, De La Salle University. Before his U.S. graduate studies, he taught at the University of the Philippines in Ateneo de Manila University. He obtained his MA from the University of Minnesota with the Fulbright Hays Fellowship and his PhD from Cornell University, where he was elected to the Phi Kappa Phi Honor Society. In Washington, D.C., he worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he retired as senior economist in 2005. In 2008, he joined the Philippine Institute for Development Studies as visiting senior research fellow, and in 2014, joined the DLSU School of Economics as visiting professor. His areas of interest are demand analysis, welfare measurement, and productivity analysis. He has published in top-tiered and referred papers in international journals such as Applied Economics, Economics Letters, Economic Modeling, Energy Economics, Journal of Productivity Analysis, Resource and Energy Economics, and Review of Income and Wealth. He is currently on the editorial boards of DLSU Business and Economics Review and the Philippine Journal of Development. He is also an occasional consultant to local and international economic organizations. In presenting the paper, Professor Dumagan will be joined by Dr. Michael R.M. Abrigo. Dr. Abrigo is a senior research fellow at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, where he examines the welfare implications of population dynamics and health policies, and among others. He's also a senior research fellow at the Luzon Clean Energy Living Laboratories at the Ateneo de Manila University School of Government. He has published numerous academic papers in journals such as Tata Journal, Public Finance Review, National Tax Journal, Lancet, and Nature. He obtained his MA and PhD in economics degrees from the University of Hawaii and his BA in Magna Cum Laude and Master of Statistics degrees from the University of the Philippines. To give his views on the findings of the featured working paper for today's Energy Policy Series, we have Dr. Jeffrey Docanes. Dr. Docanes is an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University Department of Economics. In 2014, he was awarded as Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology. He specializes in applied econometrics and has published in the areas of international migration, education, poverty, and inequality. And finally, completing the panel for today's energy policy series is our moderator during the question and answer portion, Professor Maha Ravago. Dr. Ravago is an associate professor at the Economics Department of Ateneo de Manila University. She was the program director of the USAID Grant Energy Policy and Development Program from 2014 to 2018 at the UP Econ Foundation Incorporated. Her research interests include development economics, resource economics, energy economics, and the economics of natural disasters. She has published papers on electricity, economics, resource management and sustainability, climate change, agriculture, and experimental games. She served as the president of the Philippine Economic Society in 2018 and received the 1 UP Faculty Grant Award in Economics for outstanding research and public service in UP Diliman when she was assistant professor at UP from 2016 to 2018. In 2016, she was awarded the Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Business Economics and MA in Economics from the University of the Philippines, and she obtained her PhD in Economics from the University of Hawaii in 2012 under the East-West Center Graduate Degree Fellowship Program. Undoubtedly, we have a powerhouse panel for today's energy policy series. But a few housekeeping rules before we officially kick off the EPS. Please note that the webinar is also being broadcasted simultaneously via Facebook Live. And again, for everyone's reference, you may access the full working paper on today's webinar through the link that I sent on the chat box. All participants are under mute during the entire session for us to ensure a smooth discussion and avoid any technical difficulties. During the question and answer portion, participants are instructed to use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom platform. You may start sending your questions or comments during or after the presentation of Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo. After the webinar, we will direct you all to a post-event survey to get your feedback and suggestions on today's energy policy series. And lastly, for those who are interested to obtain an electronic certificate of attendance from today's energy policy series, please remain engaged for at least an hour and accomplish the post-event survey form. The e-certificates will be sent to you all a week after the event. We would like to remind our speakers and reactor to keep your presentation within the agreed time so you have ample time for discussions. Without further ado, Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo, you have the floor.
I will could you help me out? I want to share the screen, my screen. I'm having trouble sharing my, okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir,
Mark?
we can see it. We can see it.
Okay, can I proceed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so my topic today is rational choices and welfare changes in Philippine family energy demand, evidence from the family income and expenditure surveys. And I have with me here today my co-author, Dr. Mike Abrigo. Okay. Let me now present an outline of my presentation, which is a series of questions that I will try to answer. First, what do we mean by rational choices and welfare changes? What's new in this study's analytic framework for energy demand and welfare measurement? What are the salient features of the analytic framework? What are the important empirical findings? And the last one, of course, is what you are here for. You want to find out what are the implications of the analytic framework and empirical findings for Energy Research and Policy. Now, when you talk about rational choices, well, this is economics, introductory economics. That simply means that given prices and a budget level, we choose the most satisfying or utility maximizing bundle of goods. Or given prices and a chosen bundle of goods, we buy the bundle at least cost or at minimum expenditure. Now, welfare changes. Welfare change simply means that given prices, our welfare improves if income increases. Given income, our welfare improves if prices fall. Now, our welfare is unchanged by proportional changes in prices and income. Now, when you talk about welfare, that simply means standard of living. We talk about, I'm going to talk about welfare changes, but I want you to know that we already have a measure of welfare changes. You have heard, of course, of the CPI, right? The Consumer Price Index. And the rate of change of the CPI is known as inflation. And right now, our inflation rate was estimated to be about 4.5. What does it mean? If the inflation rate is 4.5, that simply means that in order to maintain your standard of living, you need at least 4.5% of income to be fully compensated by that price change. Now, in theory, the consumer price index is really an approximation to what economists call the true cost of living index. And what Dr. Abrigo and I are trying to do is actually to estimate the true cost of living index and find out how close the CPI is to that. Now, the true cost of living index in theory cannot be estimated unless you estimate the demand system. So with your indulgence, let me proceed, all right? Now, we have to estimate a demand system that is comparable to the CPI, and therefore our coverage must be the same as the from the Family Income and Expenditure Survey, because the CPI is based on that. For our purposes, we use the 3 rounds of FICE, 209, 212, and 215. And because this study was funded by ASEP, we have to include energy. And so we included electricity, gas, and liquid fuels, solid fuels. And of course, we have to include food because the energy inputs are for cooking, okay? For lighting. Now, but because we have to exhaust the total expenditures, we have to include what we call others. So in effect, our demand system consists of five commodities. So we cannot do single demand estimation in here. It has to be a demand system. So what's new in here? The models are not new. In fact, the generalized logic model of expenditure shares that we estimated here is actually quite old. This is actually based on my doctoral dissertation, which I finished in 1991, and I have published papers out of it in these years. Now, the welfare measurement algorithm is also old. I published it in 1997. But what's new is that this is the first time that this model and this algorithm is applied to the Philippines. And of course, it's Dr. Abrigo and myself who did it. All right. Now, what are the features of this that is quite new? In our model, you don't need quantities and prices to estimate the demand system. You can just use shares and price indices which are suitable. Now, GLIMS and this GLIMS and this resort are analytical natural pairs because they are not derived from utility functions. Now, let me just show, I don't want to be show off, but this is my model, okay? I did not develop this from the start. My contribution to this one was developed by my professor and his students before me. My contribution is this equation 5, all right? Then let's just go through here. This is for show. Now, the most important feature of this model is this. equation 11 and 12. And this is my contribution. If you look at this equation, this equation are equal. And that is required for symmetry, which I will show you later, is very important in demand system estimation. So let us just proceed. Okay, now we have to do a little bit of cuentong cochero here. We just wanted to show that during this period, incomes increased, poverty decreased, and we have become less agricultural. And if you look at the energy expenditure, it turns out very small, only 7%. And then when you talk about the energy goods we included, gas only includes this petroleum gas, kerosene, you can see it, okay, bye. Now, we are looking here at what happens to the share of expenditures in energy when you buy income deciles. And it turns there is a very interesting result here. Of course, you know, the largest amount of expenditure is spent on food, but this one is very interesting. The expenditure share of solid fuels, the solid fuels are actually, I think, yung kahoy na panggatong at saka uling, and it decreases, the expenditure share decreases, well, the expenditure share decreases as incomes rise, which implies that, as we will show later, it is actually an inferior good. Now, in this table here, I show the CPI and the components as computed by the Philippine Statistical Authority. And I want you to take a look at this. This is one problem of the CPI. It has fixed weights, and they're not necessarily the same as the shares. These are the shares in 2015. Later on, I will show you what difference this makes. Now, the takeaway from all this is that during this entire period, overall welfare improved, okay? And here again, the share of energy, of the energy goods in inflation is only 7.4%, which differs from the total expenditure share of 6.6%. Now, Dr. Abrigo and I estimated two types of models. This one is the household model, and this one is the per capita model. We estimated two models because we wanted to find a range. The difference between the two is only in the expenditure variable in the demand equations. Everything else is the same. Now, this is an important table here. Some of you are familiar with this, all right? This is the table for price and income elasticities, and all of you know this. These are kind of very desirable properties. This shows that all of the on-price elasticities are negative, which means we have downward slope in demand curves. The cross-price elasticities are positive between the energy goods because they're substitutes. And the cross-price elasticity of energy with food is negative, which means they're complements because they are used together, all right? Now, look at this. As I pointed out earlier, all of the income elasticity were positive except for solid fuels, fuel and charcoal, which had negative income elasticity, which means it is inferior, all right? Now, these are nice results, but if you look at but in the context of demand analysis, although these results are nice, they are not sufficient to imply rational behavior. What you need, this one is just a similar table for the per capita model. Let me show you. This one is the Hicks. Can I remove this heading here, Mike? Because Mike, this heading here, can I remove this one?
Sure.
How do I remove it? Anyway, On top of this, this is a title known as the Hicks-Lasky substitution matrix. Now, this Hicks-Lasky substitution matrix is actually derived from the preceding table. Now, this is the most fundamental matrix in demand theory. Trust me on this. Now, it has a very specific, there are specific properties. If you look at this, row 1 is exactly the same as column 1. Row 2 is exactly the same as column 2. That means this matrix is symmetric, and the diagonal elements are negative. Now, on the bottom, I show the eigenvalues. The eigenvalues are actually like, I don't know if you have taken matrix algebra, this matrix can generate what they call a quadratic form, and the characteristic roots of that are known as the eigenvalues. Now, this is very fundamental because it must have this property. It must have the property of symmetry, and it should be negative semi-definite. Negative semi-definiteness means that one eigenvalue must be 0 and the others should be non-positive or negative. Now, what does that mean? Symmetry and negative semi-definiteness are necessary and sufficient for a demand system to be consistent with rational behavior. That means that we have estimated a model that satisfies rational behavior. Now, what does this mean? So this means, in effect, that we have validated FICE to reflect rational behavior, and therefore, we could presume that it is valid for consumer demand analysis. Why is this important? This means, therefore, that we can play around, we can now compare our model to the CPI, because the CPI is based on the same data. And this matrix implies that FICE data is valid for consumer demand analysis. Now, that matrix that I showed is negative semi-definite is important because it is required by this algorithm, okay? What we are going to do is to compute what we call the cost of living index. First, we estimate the demand system, and after having estimated the demand system, we apply this algorithm, okay? I also developed this algorithm, and I published it in 1997. And Mike and I have written an expansion of this paper where we actually computed the compensating variation and the equivalent variation. Let me proceed to the next one. Here's a very important, this really bothers me. How can I remove this, Mike? This heading. Oh my goodness. Here. And the heading here, I have compensating variation, cost of living index, and then the consumer price index. Now, what Dr. Abrigo and I are doing is simply this. We wanted to compute this numerator. This numerator cannot be computed unless you estimate the demand system. But this numerator here, all right, is just the numerator of this ratio. The denominator is actually the base period income. And this one is actually, this is minimum expenditure. The numerator is the minimum expenditure at the new price that will keep you at the same level of utility. This is what they call the true cost of living index, which in theory is approximated by the CPI. So what we're trying to do is to estimate this one based on our demand system and see how close it is to the CPI. All right? Now, so remember that this ratio is greater than 1, but by convention, we usually multiply that by 100. So for example, if this is 105, what does it mean? That means that you need 5% more than the base income to be on the same level of utility or standard of living at the new prices. Now, I talk about the compensating variation, but the compensating variation has the same variables. This is the ratio form, and this is just the difference form. If this is greater than 1, this is positive, all right? When this is greater than 1, that means that you need more at the higher prices to stay on the same level of utility. So the compensating variation is positive. That means that you have to be given money. But of course, this could be less than 1. If this is less than 1, then this is negative, and this means that the compensating variation is negative, which means that money could be taken away from you to keep you at the same level of utility because your welfare has improved. Now, it turns out that if you do simple manipulation, if you divide both sides by this one, you get this expression. This is the percent CV. And this one is actually what we call the true inflation rate. But because the CPI is an approximation to this one, what that means is that the true inflation rate is approximated by the actual inflation rate. So basically, all right, we have this. This one is computed by PSA. Dr. Abrigo and I went to this trouble of computing this one by estimating a demand system and applying a welfare change algorithm, which may not be practicable in every case. But in this instance, because we are using the entire data set, we were able to estimate this one, and we will now compare it to the CPI. And so the question is this: from the results of this study, how close is the true inflation rate to the actual inflation rate? And the reason we ask this question is this: if they are actually very close, we may not need to estimate this one by our very complicated or very elaborate system. In other words, if they are very close enough, that means that the CPI will do. So let me show you some results. I prepared the table 8, table 9, and table 10, but they tell the same story except for the difference in years. So let me just jump to the last table. Let me show you something here. Our interest is energy, right? So I highlighted energy here by red. So let me go to the next slide. Look at the price change scenarios. In this scenario, we are assuming that the price of the energy goods are increasing at the same time. And this one, 0.24, is based on the CPI as calculated by, we calculated this, but our procedure is the same as what the PSA does. Now, okay, assuming that these three prices are changing at the same time, which are all energy goods, the contribution to the CPI is 0.24. Now, take a look at this. We have two models, household and per capita. The effect of this, the percent CV, in other words, the compensating variation that you need will be 0.18 based on the household model, but for the per capita model is 0.3. If you add them up, what is it? It's 0.48, right? But 0.48 divided by 2 is exactly 24. So what that means is that this one is bracketed by the values that we computed. Now, this is, of course, for the entire population. This one represents the household model, and this one represents the per capita model. And we presume that in reality, it must be some average that will represent the entire population. Now, we did not invent this. This is the result of our estimation. In other words, the average of this and this is equal to that. And that result applies to the others. The sum of this and this one divided by 2 is exactly equal to this. So what is the conclusion? That means that the percent energy price is approximately equal to the average of the household and per capita energy, CV and EV. So what that means is that the true cost of living index, as we estimated in a very elaborate way, is approximated closely enough by the CPI. So if you want to find out the effect on welfare of prices, there is no need for you to do what we did. The CPI procedure will do. So that's our conclusion here. So the percent CV is computed by resort, our welfare change algorithm based on the demand system. The percent change is from FICE as computed by PSA. But we found that they have the same sign and approximate size. And so, and this percent price change is essentially the contribution to the inflation rate of the CPI. And so we conclude that to determine the welfare effects of energy policies, knowing their effects on energy prices and knowing their contributions to CPI inflation are expedient and practical if demand system estimation is infeasible. In other words, we have provided, if there's any contribution we have done so far, we have provided sort of an analytic and an empirical justification to use the CPI for welfare change analysis. But of course, if it is possible for you to estimate the demand system, we will recommend our method. But if you cannot do it, it turns out that the CPI procedure done by PSA will do. Now, how does this apply to energy? Let me give you an example. Okay, let's illustrate the conclusions. Welfare effects, for example, of energy efficiency improvements. This is a decomposition done by PSA. Can I move this? Okay. Let's take a look at this. This one is actually, this is PSA, all right? So this is the inflation, the all items inflation. The total inflation rate is 3.08 during this period. The inflation rate for electricity is given by this. But you know, when people look at this table, the usually their complaints are based on D, which is actually incorrect. Look at the electricity price inflation, it's 4.26. But the contribution to the inflation, to the overall inflation, is not this. It is equal to this multiplied by its weight, as given here. So this is the weight. So divide this by 100, multiply that, and so it's this. Do the same thing with the others. So what that means, based on official data, the effect of energy price inflation is just the sum of this, which equals to 0.28. So what that means is that this price inflation of energy, which is 0.28%, only requires 0.28% more expenditures for you to be restored to the original level of utility. But lo and behold, you don't have to do much, because what is 0.28%? This can be compensated simply by doing, costless waste reduction based on what I found from the household energy consumption survey. Now, what are examples? Look at this. Now, look at this pie, okay? What you need to do is to compute this. This is actually the end-use price. This is the end-use price of energy, which is important in the household setting, because the price that is really effective for household is not the market price of energy, it's the end-use price. But the end-use price is just the market price less the efficiency improvement. And by the way, that pie is actually the rate of change of market price weighted by the energy expenditure share. So if you don't use electricity, what is this? That's zero. Now, so this is the rate of change of market price weighted by this. And this is the rate of change in household energy efficiency. So this one, it's possible that this could even be negative. But when this is negative, price has fallen, that means the welfare is improved. So that means that you can just use the CPI calculations to calculate this one weighted by the expenditure share. Now, there are plenty of opportunities for energy conservation. This one is data from the household energy consumption survey. 91% of households have switched off lights when not needed. 85% opted for natural lighting, 75% blah, 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 and then, and many more. And then the Department of Energy has also some programs. In this survey, they found that more households have practiced energy conservation measures, and the number of households that are aware of the energy labeling program has increased to 26% from 10.3% between the 2 years. And they have also an energy labeling program that, if you can believe it, has increased energy savings by 28.7%. That's why I put an exclamation point. This is incredible. Incredible. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dumagan, as well as Dr. Abrigo, for such a very comprehensive presentation. And at this point, we encourage all our participants to start sending their questions, all your questions, through the chat function. And we're very pleased to have 100 participants today. In sending your questions, do not forget to state your name and affiliation. And so moving forward, let's have our discussant, Professor Ducanes, to present his views on the key findings of the working paper presented by Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo. You have the floor, Professor Ducanes.
Okay, I'll just open my presentation. So good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, sir.
First, thank you. So I would first like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be a discussant in this seminar. I would also like to congratulate Dr. Jess Dumagan and Dr. Mike Abrigo for a very interesting and well-written paper. In my specific comments later on, I will focus on where I think the paper could be improved on, because that is the purpose of these discussions. But in my view, so that we don't forget it, overall, I think it is a high-quality paper. So as is usual in discussions, I'll start by giving a brief summary of the paper as I understand it, after which I will give my comments. So building on previous theoretical and empirical work done by one or both of the authors, the paper estimates a consumer demand system for the Philippines with specific focus on energy demand. Using regionally aggregated data from the 3 rounds of the Family Income and Expenditure Survey from 2009 to 2015. The main finding is that the estimated demand system satisfies the conditions for rationality. And this is justification for using the estimated demand system and CPI data over time to compute for the monetary equivalent of welfare changes due to price increases in the period of study. So just the broad comments, the paper is very analytical and yet very clearly written. And as far as I can work out, given the limits of my own knowledge, the study is technically sound. So it builds on previous work by one or both of the authors, as I've said, specifically the generalized logit model of expenditure shares. I will call it GILMES, and the reversible second-order Taylor algorithm or resort, which are important and useful contributions to the demand system literature. But this particular paper, the intended contribution to the literature is the empirical results using Philippine data with focus on energy demand. In my opinion, however, the current empirical approach used limits its usefulness to shed light on current policy issues and could also be improved on with more robustness checks. So I have 2 main comments, and this is the first one, which has to do mainly with the robustness check. So when estimating a demand system, there's always that issue of which income or expenditure variable to use as denominator when estimating expenditure shares. So shares of what? The paper uses household current expenditure, whether total or per capita, but of course it is not the only option. One can also use household total disbursements, which would include not only current expenditures, but also expenditures on investment type items. For example, it includes purchase or amortization of real property, construction of new house, and maybe more importantly, installments on appliances and transport vehicles bought before the FIES year. Properly including demand for appliances and transport vehicles, for example, which can be expected to be strongly linked to demand for energy, seems particularly important. Most appliances will be complements to energy demand, but cooking appliances, for example, could be substitutes for solid fuel demand. In fact, if you look at other estimates of consumer demand system, many of them actually include purchase of durable goods as a separate expenditure category. This is certain to matter, for example, in the magnitude of the estimated elasticities, if not their statistical significance. The tables in this slide, for example, show how estimated electricity share and food share differ depending on the income or expenditure measure used. And there is especially a more noticeable change at the higher income levels, since they are the ones with more investment type expenditures and savings. For example, as you can see from the table, the electricity share for the 10th decile is 4.9% based on expenditure, but only 3.1% based on income, and somewhere in between based on disbursements. Food share is 28.9% based on expenditure, but only 20.3% based on income. In my opinion, using alternative measures of income or expenditure seems a more interesting robustness check than estimating separately using per capita and total household income or expenditure. My second comment is that I think the decision to aggregate the data at the regional level rather than using the household level data, which is the real FIES, for the estimation weakens the usefulness of the model. These types of models are usually estimated using household level data, even in the literature referenced by the study. By aggregating the data, it makes the findings subject to aggregation bias. The paper ends up testing the rationality of the demand system for the average regional consumers rather than the consumers in general. But if you are only looking at the average regional consumers, then that's very different. For example, you won't get any poor consumer, you won't get any rich consumer. You will just get the average consumer. So this glosses over the heterogeneity of consumers and the fact that even within regions, prices can vary by a lot. For example, this is very true for electricity prices, which varies by franchise area, which is much smaller than the region. And in fact, sometimes it varies within franchise areas. The paper also shows, for example, that the Gilmes parameter estimates presented can vary significantly depending on the control variables included. So in the paper, because only regional data was used, the parameters varied just by including and excluding control variables for year and region. So using regional level data precludes the inclusion of control variables, such as, for example, the demographic characteristics of the consumers that could be expected to influence expenditure shares on different items. I think an important implication of this is that it limits the policy usefulness of the results, specifically its usefulness for micro simulations. For example, one issue being discussed now is the gradual phasing out of the universal charge missionary electrification. So this will impact the electricity prices faced by consumers in small islands not connected to the grid, which is currently very heavily subsidized. So these consumers are likely significantly different from consumers elsewhere, meaning not in small islands, not connected to the grid, in terms of their profile, in terms of their education, income, etc. And a model that does not allow for control for such heterogeneity could mismeasure the welfare impact of possible price changes on them. Of course, a limit faced by the study is that consumer price index is only available in published form at the regional level. I think PSA actually gives you the provincial level CPI if you request for it. But if this is the reason for using region aggregated data, then perhaps the authors can explore the construction of individual specific prices from aggregated prices. And there are published papers that show how this could possibly be done. Okay, just to summarize, so I have two recommendations. First is to test for robustness of the results using alternative measures of income or expenditure. And second, to estimate the model using household level data rather than aggregated regional data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Docanes, for those very insightful comments and recommendations. And now I'd like to ask the authors of the paper, Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo, to please provide a brief response to the comments and views made by our reactor.
May I answer Jeff's comments? Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much for having me here today in the seminar. Well, medyo mahirap yung mga, well, first we are very thankful to Jeff for his very insightful comments as always. But some of the answers to his questions are quite technical. First, why did we use these set of expenditures and why these set of income and not yung mga alternatives na binigay niya? And one answer to that is that we are following standard economic theory and standard assumptions and procedures in the literature, which is essentially saying that nothing is wasted. So whatever we use, whatever we've expended, that is equal to our income, and that is standard in the literature. So yung paggamit ng alternative incomes like adding other types of disbursement and so on, that could be included, but that is not the demand system that we are estimating. We are estimating the specific demand system. And then about more disaggregation, well, more disaggregation of the expenditure items. Actually, that can be done, but again, in this instance, we are just focusing on these energy expenditures and not yung mga durables. Although we recognize that that is important and that is actually used in the literature, and currently in our current model that is included in the others category. On his comments about aggregation, why we are using regional data instead of household data, that is a very good question. And actually, we started out using household data, but then we faced many problems, and some of these problems he also recognized. One is that we do not have prices at the household level. Well, provincial level is sabi niya na it could be available from PSA, but what we have right now is regional data from PSA. There are some prices. It can be backed out from the expenditure survey. But then, unfortunately, we do not have the same disaggregation that we want and that we need. So we ended up aggregating it at the regional level. So on a question about yung estimates namin is dependent on the controls that we use. Actually, these controls are selected to highlight na we are trying to address some econometric issues, and by including these controls, we are actually addressing these issues. Dr. Jess, do you have more reply?
Yeah, I'd like to address the issue about the applicability of our analysis to consumers like that he mentioned that are customers actually of the small public utilities group. If I can just go back to my slides, I'll just show something. Mark, how do I do that?
Sir, I think you are given the permission to start sharing. Adrian?
Okay.
Yeah, you can.
Let me go back to this slide again. As I said, what if there's any contribution that Dr. Abrigo and I have done here is to show that the cost of living index based on economic theory is approximately the same as the CPI that PSA does. So our conclusion is that If you can estimate a demand system, please do, be our guest. But if you cannot estimate a demand system, use the CPI method. So in the case, for example, of customers, that was referred to by Dr. Ducanis, you will not be able to estimate the demand system. So what I would suggest is to replicate, a table like this for that specific group. Now, he's talking about the highly subsidized group. The period was passed in 2001. A lot of people think that Napocor is dead. No, Napocor is still there. They are the ones that are servicing they are operating the small public utilities group, and the consumers are not connected to the grid. This type of consumers are very highly subsidized. In fact, I just look at my electric bill. I myself are subsidizing these people. For every kilowatt hour that I consume, I'm actually subsidizing these people a little over 15 centavos. Now, how are we going to analyze the welfare effects of removing the subsidies? This is what I will do. I will just construct a table like this for the status quo where there are subsidies, and then do the same thing by removing the subsidies. And then from the differences, you can actually make inferences about the welfare effects of removing subsidies. And you can do it in a very detailed way. You can construct this. Of course, they consume electricity. They also consume this, they also consume this, they also consume this. And then PSA has, in fact, more detailed data that will allow you. So in other words, what I'm saying is that in principle, this kind of analysis can be replicated for any group of consumers that you want to study, provided that the data is available from PSA. So what we have done is not really limiting the analysis. I do agree that estimating a demand system and applying our welfare change algorithm just to find out the true cost of living index is very impractical. You cannot do that in every case. But because we have shown that the results of that elaborate theoretical cost of living index, because it is close to the CPI, then the CPI is workable. It's practical. That's the one that I'm recommending. So I rest my case. I'm telling you, this type of analysis, it can be done for any group. Just do before subsidies, after subsidies, and then you can calculate the effect on welfare of the removal of subsidies. And that should not be a problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dumagan and Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo for your responses. And that's the purpose of Energy Policy Series. It's a continuous conversation. Even after this forum, there would be more. I'm very confident that a lot of discussions will be reverberating because of the key findings of this paper. And so I think we now turn to our open discussion. We give our participants the chance to also interact and share their thoughts or raise their questions. Again, we remind all participants to use the chat box to send in your questions, and please indicate your name and affiliation. And again, we are very happy that our open forum will be moderated by Professor Maharavago. Go ahead, Professor Ravago.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Before we do the Q&A, let me congratulate again Jess and Mike for a very analytical and well-written paper. No? So I think the purpose really of this webinar is to solicit more comments, right? And probably prepare for Jess and Mike's submission to a journal. Is that right? Okay, so so as Mark's mentioned earlier, we invite the audience to put their questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat box. So please put your questions in the Q&A. Okay, as we are waiting for the audience to mull on their questions, I'd like to make also some comments on the presentation. As you mentioned earlier, I think the substitution happens as for the household, right? As their income rises, they substitute solid fuels to a more, let's say, electricity and LPG. So this has already been found in the literature, and it's very consistent. Your finding is very consistent. But I guess for purposes of for the Philippines, maybe it's also useful, I mean, in your paper, to do a decile presentation of the results, so that because you're looking at welfare changes and demand. So the energy or electricity demand across decile might be different, as you have already shown, right? So that might be useful, that might have useful policy implication. And then so that would bring us to the concept of costless waste reduction that you mentioned. Because the costless waste reduction, I guess this is something related to energy efficiency, right?
Yes.
Most commonly or very relevant for developed countries, because for developing country like the Philippines, the challenge really is access, right? So how do we make the discussion of energy efficiency or costless waste reduction be more meaningful for developing countries like the Philippines? Just to kick up the discussion, Jess and Mike, you may react.
All right. First of all, our data, I don't know, our model is very disaggregated. And the reason is that we just want to be able to get a sense of how close the true cost of living index is to the CPI, all right? That's really basically, so look, like a first approximation. And the reason why we applied it to energy is because, well, our contract is from us itself, right? So we have to include energy. So we included 3, and we included food, because the energy inputs are used for cooking, space heating, something like that. But in order to be able to compare the true cost of living index that we're trying to estimate to the CPI, we must cover the same amount, the same level of expenditure. So whatever is used for the CPI should also be the same as what we use. We have to exhaust it. Now, we have to limit the demand system. We have to limit it to 5, because it can be very unwieldy. 5 is big enough. So what we did, we have 3 energy goods, food, and others. This is the first time, Maha, that I think anyone has tried. And with all modesty, I think Mike and I were the first one to estimate that demand system with the negative semi-definite Hicks-Lasky substitution matrix. We wouldn't be talking here, Maha, if we had not estimated that matrix with that property. You know why? Because unless that matrix is satisfied, nothing makes sense. Nothing makes sense. So we got that, we proceeded. But of course, this is not perfect. This is a first approximation, for goodness sake. I don't know of anyone who has estimated a complete demand system for FICE. Tell me, has anybody done that? I don't know. So
yes, congratulations, Jess, for doing this.
So what I'm saying is, all your points, the technical points raised by Jeff, are kind of refinements that in the future, Mike and I will be happy to do that.
Yes.
For example, in this model, we have fixed effects, and we have only just fixed effects. There are no demographic variables, none. All I wanted to show is that I have a demand system that satisfies rationality, and then, which means that by implication, the FICE data can be useful for consumer demand analysis. I mean, my result is not a proof, but it gives a presumption that FICE data is consistent with rational behavior, and therefore the CPI is valid.
Okay.
And so for future refinements, we will do the best we can for future refinements. But I'm happy with it. A good beginning, I think.
Yes, of course. Okay.
Congratulations to Mike.
Yes.
He's the first one to estimate that matrix. I did it in 1991, and I didn't want to do it because I cannot do it anymore.
Okay. We have a couple of questions in the chat box, so let me read them. This is from Isabelo Rabuya. Is residential electricity demand elastic enough to implement demand response strategies? By demand response strategies, hourly varying rates to encourage consumption during off-peak hours. So Mike, even Jeff can join in in answering this question. So please.
Now that is actually a very interesting question because look, our the demand function that we estimated is for energy, right? It's for energy. But remember that energy here is actually an input.
Mm-hmm.
It is an input to household use. Now, under a fixed coefficient technology, that demand function also represents final demand. But here's the problem. When you improve energy efficiency, okay, given the same market price, right? Given the same market price, if you improve energy efficiency, the household input use price reduces. So the guy will buy more energy, And it's possible that the guy that is trying to conserve energy will in fact consume more. I'll give you an example. It's just like the demand function for gasoline. Actually, the relevant demand function is the demand for miles, right? But the price per mile is the price per gallon divided by MPG, right? So when the price per gallon efficiency increases, the price per mile falls. And the guy could end up traveling more and in fact, consume more gasoline. The same thing could happen to electricity. It's kind of a rebound effect, you're now more efficient. So it's now the end use price is cheaper. You can end up consuming more electricity as a matter of fact.
Yes, I agree. That concept of rebound effect, but in a sense, it also improves our welfare, right? Because we are consuming.
Yes. Because what really matters is that you are going down on your demand curve, even if you are consuming more energy. Because what happens is the end use price.
Okay.
Given the same market price, an improvement in efficiency reduces your end use price. So you go down your demand curve. In effect, you have a higher level of welfare.
Yes. Mike,
Now,
any thoughts on the demand response strategies?
Well, thank you so much, Mahab. Well, based on our estimates, our elasticity is quite inelastic, which is similar to results in other estimation for the Philippines. So I guess, but I guess it's not just prices that are important in nudging people to certain behavior. I know, Maha, you have a paper on behavioral nudges on smart metering to nudge people to specific behavior. So I guess it's not just price, even if our elasticities are quite inelastic. There are other ways to nudge people to more, I guess, pro-social, renewable behavior.
Okay, thanks. We have another question here, not necessarily on demand, but I would like to ask the opinion or what the panelists, or the opinion of the panelists. So this is a question from Hiao Xiao Lim, if I pronounce it correctly. Would you agree that it is high time to roll out renewable energy in the NPC SPAG areas? Anybody from Jeff, Jess, and Mike?
Renewable energy in the SPAG areas?
NPC SPAG areas. Yeah. Any thoughts on this?
Well, these guys are not hooked up to the grid, right, Jeff? And so maybe if you talk about solar, you're going to have solar panels on the roofs. It doesn't have to be connected to the grid because it's basically for self-consumption. The problem though with solar, it's very expensive. I look at I look at estimates about the levelized cost of energy. My goodness, solar is 5 times the price of hydro, I think. It's very expensive. So of course, if you're not hooked up to the grid, you can have solar panels if you can afford it. And in some cases in the US, a lot of homes that have shifted to solar, they are now even selling to the grid if they're hooked up. Because if they're producing a lot of solar energy and they don't use that much, some of it could actually be what they call reverse metering. You might have heard of that. So if you are producing more solar energy than you are using at home, you can actually sell that to the grid. Now, I don't know if this is practical for those guys in SPUG. In the first place, it's very expensive. That's why they are subsidized, for goodness sake.
Okay. Yeah. And any thoughts, Jeff, Mike?
I think so. We did some work on off-grid areas also. The cost of providing them electricity is actually very high. It's like sometimes 3 times more than 3 times the cost compared to grid areas. So possibly for many of them, it actually makes sense to already go to renewable energy, especially solar. Maybe it makes because prices are also declining. Perhaps now it actually makes sense already, especially if the UCME subsidy, for example, will be removed. So that means that they will be facing higher prices. So they have to compare that possibility against the cost of investing in solar, for example, now. So if they do that computation, maybe it actually makes economic sense now to invest in solar.
And if I may add, Jeff, if you remove the subsidies, they might be induced to go to solar. But that's another issue. If you remove the subsidies, oh my goodness. I'm old enough to remember when people were, there was a time before EPIRA when people, napukor, nasaan po ang kuryente. So EPIRA, I thought, killed Napukor. Napukor still there because of SPUG. But these people that are being serviced are highly subsidized. If you remove the subsidies, they might shift to solar. But
Yes.
I'm not saying we should do that.
Okay. Mike?
Well, I agree that it all boils down to what's the benefit and cost of doing each of these alternatives. And I guess in some instances it could be way better to do it to roll out renewable energy. But then in some instances na talagang malayo, and there are reports, of course, na it's not just about setting up these renewable energy plants, but also yung upkeep. Because even if you let it out there, well, there are evidences na marami dito sa mga hindi naman nasusundan, so they deteriorate in time. So I guess again it all boils down to whether the benefit outweighs the cost of doing this, and if it's cheaper. And from the question and answer box, there's comment saying that off-grid solar is around 1.5 times the cost of grid electricity. So I guess in some sense it's okay.
Yes, so actually this is a very interesting research, maybe for ASAP selves to do this cost-benefit analysis, because not all solution can be applied to all, right? So might be good to do the cost-benefit analysis, the levelized cost for each area, rather than, because we're all providing all our opinions here, but it would be better, it would be based on evidence and analytical evidence. So that may be a project for ASAP cells. Okay, any other question that we see from
Professor Ravago, we have from Dr. Yap, are also the senior technical
yeah. So it's in the chat box. Okay,
yes.
So here is an observation from Dr. Joseph Yap. Given that energy efficiency measures have a significant impact, the savings can be used to accommodate a rise in electricity prices that may be accompanied by greater reliance on variable renewable energy. Energy savings will be offset by rise in prices, but there is a net gain in terms of reduction in GHG emissions. So it's an observation from Dr. Yap. Okay, so there's several comment here also in the chat box. There is now a policy to hybridize the mix in off-grid areas. The impact of RE in off-grid is minimal since the system is small and the capacity credits for solar and wind are low. This is from Michael Sinocruz. Okay, any other comments on this from the panels? Okay. I have another question. The estimation that you did is based on the data, right? The FIES and the HEX, right? Is there a way to do this prospectively? Because the demand for developing countries like the Philippines would be changing, and in fact, the worldwide demand for electricity and energy would likely come from developing country. Is there a way you can do like a simulation, given that we know how the demand would change over time? Would you be able to do this? Would you be able to apply the estimation technique that you did in the paper, Mike?
So, thanks, Maha. Well, definitely. Actually, we're still debating on whether we'll include this, but we've actually done some simulation on what will happen if we shift to the 2040. Sir, I'd say this: the 2040 clean energy scenario for the Philippines. And what we found out is that if that happens today, using the levelized cost that we have, prices would go up by about 27%. So that's quite high, right? Given the price that we have. But then again, ganun ba kaliit yung share ng ating electricity sa ating buong CPI is quite small. So in the big picture, hindi naman ganun kalaki yung itataas ng prices ng buong CPI. But then again, it's still significant. It would lower yung welfare ng ating household, and we need to compensate them for that. So the short answer is yes, we can use this for simulations.
Okay. It's already 11:44. I'm calling for the last question if there are any. Okay, if none, we're taking notes of all the comments in the Q&A and chat, and this will be passed on to the authors and even to Jeff and also to ASAP Cells, right? So thank you very much to the audience for participating in the Q&A. Mark?
Thank you very much, Professor Ravago, and to all our audience for the response and the comments that you're making. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the webinar. I know there are a lot of answers that we obtained from the insights shared by the authors, but also more questions to ponder on. Once again, join me in thanking our powerhouse and stellar panelists for their astute insights and perspectives, and also thank you to all our very strong, I think we have 100 participants for today's energy policy series. And so thank you to all our audience for being engaged throughout the webinar. And so that concludes the second installment of the energy policy series for 2021. Stay tuned for the succeeding episodes of the energy policy series in the coming months. And just looking into our research pipeline, we're very excited for more research working papers that are coming up in the next couple of months. And amidst the challenges of the ongoing pandemic, the Energy Policy Series has been a critical catalyst in bridging the gap of rigorous theoretical and practical research, and complemented by on-ground insights from industry and government partners, as well as key decision makers. To this end, we hope that the Energy Policy Series and ASAP Cells continue to spark debate and intellectual exchange that translates to genuine energy policies with the potential flow-on effects in the grassroots communities throughout the country. Again, you may access the working paper of Professor Dumagan and Dr. Abrigo through the link provided in the chat box, and also you may check it out at the ASOG's website. Don't forget to fill in our post-event survey form. We would be delighted to hear your feedback and thoughts about today's webinar. The Energy Policy Series is presented by ASAP Cells, supported by the European Union and implemented by the Ateneo School of Government. Please visit our website at asapcells.com, and like ASOG's Facebook page for more updates on our next energy policy series and research publications. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you once again.
Mark, picture lang.
Sure. Yeah, we
So
forgot
to the panel, we'll just take a
for the
picture.
panel.
So
Yeah.
please smile in 1, 2, 3. Another one, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
So there you go. Thank you again to our panelists and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Salamat.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Salamat. Congrats.
Mike. Maraming salamat po, Mike.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.